And the molecular processes associated with fasting and caloric restriction were studied. And do you know what the basis is? It is very trendy right now. The activation of autophagy processes. What is autophagy? Now that it is very trendy, recycling. Recycle, instead of creating more waste, we are going to recycle that waste and make it help us function again. That is autophagy. The organism is capable of eliminating things that are not functioning, that are causing a problem. I break them down, recycle them, and form new organelles that will help my organism function well again. This is autophagy. Autophagy is when those organelles that are not functioning go to certain organs called lysosomes. These lysosomes degrade them, and from there, new organelles are formed that are perfectly functional. And when this autophagy is activated, it occurs when insulin levels and amino acid levels evidently decrease. As seen in the image, there is a depletion of acetyl-CoA and therefore genetic processes of histone deacetylation, which are epigenetic changes, and methylation are activated. The process of methylation is to protect the structure of the gene. And when methylation is increased, for example, it decreases the likelihood that a proton can become activated. And if it activates, it can lead to cancer. This means that these methylation processes increase the levels of nicotine, amine, and adenine from those acetylases, stimulating these histones from those acetylases, such as sirtuins. And this will lead to the stimulation of key metabolism genes. As we see, PGC1A is a key gene for glucose metabolism, and of lipids. Moreover, they produce what is called mitochondrial biogenesis. And maybe you will ask, what is a mitochondrion? Well, a mitochondrion is like the energy keys of our cells, which will produce a substance called ATP, which is our energy. So they will make our mitochondria work better and generate less waste, which is from free radicals. It is oxidative stress that harms us. This mitochondrial biogenesis will make the cell function better. That is, fasting activates nuclear transcription processes such as the repair and catabolic AMPK and inhibits the mTOR pathway. However, feeding will produce the opposite effect and will enhance anabolic processes. And intermittent fasting will produce what are called metabolic adaptations. For example, a fast lasting between 12 to 36 hours will result in hepatic glycogenolysis. That is, the glycogen stored in our liver will break down and form ketone bodies. When fasting is longer, between 36 to 72 hours or even more, ketogenesis will occur, meaning that ketone bodies will be synthesized again in both the liver and the brain in the astrocytes. And these ketone bodies will be the food for our brain. The brain has the ability to feed on ketone bodies up to 70%, and this will produce these two ketone bodies primarily through beta hydroxybutyrate, BHB. It will increase the synthesis of BDNF, which we have seen before. Do you remember the previous slide? BDNF is a neurotrophic factor that stimulates new neuronal synapses and the formation of new neurons. It also improves the cholinergic system, which is related to memory. Additionally, as seen here, it enhances the synthesis of metabolic keys called PGC1A and mitochondrial biogenesis. And it also stimulates the synthesis of histone deacetylase, particularly from sirtuin-3, which we have already mentioned as beneficial. Furthermore, this sirtuin-3 will eliminate oxidative stress and remove mechanisms of apoptosis. Improvement. The first thing patients tell you when they start fasting is that they feel much better at a cerebral level. They are more lucid, have greater capacity, and feel stronger because it acts directly on the brain. What types of fasting are there? Well, let's first define what fasting is. It is the voluntary abstinence, evidently, from food and drink for determined periods and in a consistent manner. The ideal fasting regimen depends on each individual's lifestyle and tolerability. Let's see. I always say that a person who is used to living and eating the current diet, which consists of processed foods, a high amount of fatty foods, and simple carbohydrates, cannot suddenly start intermittent fasting overnight because they will not be able to handle it. It will produce a series of symptoms that they won't be able to cope with. What should be done first? Maintaining a healthy diet, reducing fast-absorbing sugars, and possibly following a very low-carb diet or adopting a ketogenic diet that is slightly changing eating habits, and then you can start fasting. What type of fasting is there? Well, there is alternate day fasting, meaning 1 day of normal eating and 1 day of fasting, but that fasting day is not a complete fast. Rather, it is 25% of your daily requirement. That is 25% of the amount of calories you need in a day. And in a single meal, of course, let's remember the circadian rhythm in the early hours of the day. Then we have the complete day fasting, which usually consists of 5 days of normal eating according to your caloric requirements, and 2 days of fasting that can be consecutive or interspersed, but complete fasting. Then we have caloric restriction, which is a restriction of calories between 15% and 60%. But nowadays, the truth is that caloric restriction is very difficult to maintain due to the lifestyle that humans have today. It is very challenging. It has no advantage over fasting, especially in matters such as the restoration of insulin sensitivity, which means we would place caloric restoration last. Next, we would have time-restricted feeding, that is a feeding window. Here we have the most common ones, the 16-8 or the 12-12, meaning 8 hours of feeding and 16 hours of fasting. Where should we schedule that feeding time? It is clear, as we have said, circadian rhythm, the first hours of the day, at most 6 to 8 in the evening. After 8 in the evening, do not eat anything until reaching those 16 hours until the next day. That would be the logical approach. And then we would have the diets that mimic fasting, which are diets that use macronutrients that resemble what it would be like if we were fasting, done on specific days of the month, once a month, or every 3-4 months in a cyclical manner. And what are the benefits of this fasting? Well, it leads to weight loss and maintenance in people who are overweight and obese. We lose weight. The glucose homeostasis in obese individuals who already have type 2 diabetes can be controlled because it reduces body fat and is able to normalize glycosylated hemoglobin. There is a significant survival rate and recovery of cardiac function, and the modulation of cardiovascular risks in patients who have heart involvement or have even had a heart attack. It can protect neurons against aging disorders such as Alzheimer's and stroke. Through what? As we have said, through ketone bodies. Let us not forget that for our brain, its fundamental source of energy is ketone bodies, up to 70%. Look, there is a study that has come out very recently about the ketogenic diet. It is capable of acting at the level of Alzheimer's in the treatment and prevention of these patients. Moreover, fasting, as we have said, reduces insulin resistance more effectively much earlier than caloric restriction. In overweight and obese individuals who are not yet diabetic, it may therefore play an important role in protection against obesity-related cancers. Do not forget that in cancers and in insulin spikes, through the insulin growth factor, IGF-1 is capable of stimulating the production of cancers. There are decreases, of course, in resting heart rate, meaning that blood pressure, insulin, circulating glucose levels, and homocysteine levels drop, which are favorable regarding the risk of cardiovascular disease. It reduces fat mass, total cholesterol, and LDL. There is an equivalent reduction in blood pressure, a reduction in serum triglycerides, markers of oxidative stress and inflammation. Circulating ketone levels also rise on fasting days. No, that's incorrect. On fasting days, obviously, but even on non-fasting days, there can still be ketones circulating if a consistent diet is followed. Effects are produced on a series of cancer risk biomarkers, such as insulin, cytokines, leptin, and adiponectin, which are related to inflammation and are believed to mediate the effects of adiposity and excessive energy intake. In the development and growth of cancer, there is a reduction, as we have said, of insulin growth factor in normal and overweight subjects. Prolonged fasting for at least 3 days, whether through intermittent fasting, time-restricted feeding, or alternate day fasting, leads to the breakdown of a large number of white blood cells, enabling stem cells to regenerate. New cells in the immune system, which means we are also regenerating our immune system. Recycling. Don't forget, we are recycling, which means that if we recycle our immune system cells, they will be more active and healthier. Here we have a summary table of the different types of restriction and fasting. Here we have above the caloric restriction with the standard macronutrient index. There should be a time restriction, as we have mentioned during the day, the time of light. There are studies in both rats and lower organisms, but there are also studies in monkeys, which show that caloric restriction, as I have explained, was among the first studies known to increase the average lifespan of these animals. And regarding health effects, caloric restriction prevents obesity, diabetes, oxidative stress, and hypertension. Aging, cancer, cardiovascular diseases. Time-restricted fasting, as we have already mentioned, from 8 to 12 hours. There are studies with standard diets on feeding days, even with obesogenic diets, with more calories than one should consume. There are studies, and there is no data with this type of fasting. There is no data that it is truly capable of increasing longevity. However, the effects on health are indeed important. Defense against type 2 diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and hypercholesterolemia. Next, we have intermittent fasting, which we have discussed, either 25% in a single meal or actual fasting on alternate days. There are studies at the rat level that show it can indeed increase lifespan and protect against obesity, oxidative stress, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, neurodegeneration, and diabetes. And then there is the fasting mimicking diet, which is the diet of, oh my God, well, what I mentioned before, the diets that mimic fasting, which is 30% less than the daily caloric intake needed for 5 consecutive days. And then you return to normal eating once a month, every 3 or 4 months in a year, done in cycles, okay? And there are studies at the rat level that show it increases lifespan and protects us from cancer, diabetes, and other risk factors associated with diseases related to aging. What are the side effects of fasting? The most common one, of course, in the first few days is hunger. But well, hunger only lasts during the first days of the regimen and is quickly controlled. What about insomnia and anxiety due to an increase in stress hormones like cortisol after 12 hours of fasting? And how do we control this? Well, with proper sleep hygiene at bedtime, avoiding blue light, mobile phones, the TV, and so on. You can take baths with Epsom salts, which will help us relax. Taking chelated magnesium, which is better absorbed, or L-theanine at 4 p.m. and 10 p.m., which will help us relax throughout the day. There may also be bad breath and the tongue may turn white. And there is a taste of acetone because we are burning fat, which makes sense. What do we do about it? Drink plenty of fluids and brush our teeth more frequently. We can also experience digestive problems such as constipation, diarrhea, nausea, and bloating, which are often associated with the days we eat. It is also logical, as choosing foods rich in fiber and adequate hydration, let's not forget hydration, is important, and we can use magnesium carbonate if necessary in case of constipation. In the case of diarrhea, for example, there are more things, but the psyllium shell dissolved in a glass of water should be left to rest for about 5 to 10 minutes. First thing in the morning, and it can even be repeated if we do not control it late in the afternoon. And of course, if the diarrhea is very profuse, it is necessary to take electrolytes to prevent any type of health alteration. Also, other types of symptoms such as irritability, mood swings, and mental fog can occur after a period of fasting. This is logical because insulin levels will decrease, leading the kidneys to increase the excretion of fluid and sodium. You will see that when you have been fasting for a while, you are constantly needing to urinate. Of course, as insulin levels decrease, the kidney releases water and, of course, releases sodium. What do we have to do? A pinch of salt in water can be taken, or bone broth can be consumed. Alternatively, non-starchy vegetable broth can be used because if we include starch, we are introducing carbohydrates, which will prevent ketogenesis. Then there is acid reflux. It is rare for this to occur, and if it does happen, It is usually in people who have a history of reflux or who consume rapidly assimilated carbohydrates on feeding days. That should not be done. So what can we do? Add natural lemon juice to the water, either apple cider vinegar, or we can also use deglycerinated licorice. What are the contraindications of fasting? The absolute contraindication, that is the one that no one should do, is if there is cachexia, if there are eating disorders such as anorexia nervosa, if there is uncontrolled hypothyroidism, if there is dementia, or if there is advanced cerebrovascular insufficiency. If there is advanced liver or kidney insufficiency, and of course in physiological cases of pregnancy and lactation, and relative procedures which are relative could be performed under medical supervision, but always under medical supervision. Type 1 diabetes, psychotic disorders, unstable or severe coronary artery disease, gastric or duodenal ulcer, advanced dementia or cerebrovascular insufficiency, and cancer. Although in cancer, as long as there is professional advice. As we have seen before, regarding all the metabolic keys that arise from the deacetylation and methylation of genes, is quite beneficial to utilize. And of course, if you are taking medication, it needs to be adjusted during fasting therapy. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs need to be adjusted, as well as corticosteroids. Antihypertensives, especially if they are diuretics and beta blockers, should be adjusted because, as we mentioned, when insulin levels drop, the excretion of water and sodium increases, which can lead to hyponatremia and may cause problems. Anti-diabetics, of course, there is less insulin, so we don't need as much anti-diabetic medication or as many doses of insulin. Contraceptives, because their effectiveness decreases. Anticoagulants, psychotropics, primarily neuroelectrics, lithium, and anticonvulsants. And to conclude, let's summarize what we have learned. Fasting, what does it do? It activates molecular processes of cellular repair and catabolism, recycling, autophagy. It activates epigenetic processes of methylation and acetylation, acting on lifespan extension and also on metabolic processes. It regulates circadian oscillations and thus metabolic parameters. It is the most effective intervention alongside physical exercise for reducing visceral fat and low-grade inflammation. So as a general guideline for anyone who wants to start taking care of their diet and so on, just as a general guideline, okay, we can have a daily diet that is mostly vegan, with low content of meat proteins and yes to fish proteins 3 times a week. Always try to consume show bluefish, which is a small fish that has a high content of omega-3. Avoid large fish, such as tuna, salmon, and swordfish, as these tend to have a high mercury content. Mercury reaches us and produces a high stimulus of inflammation, oxidative stress, arteriosclerosis, and promotes the formation of atheromatous plaques, which also affects the brain. To have 2 meals a day, and in the first part of the day, as we have said and reiterated according to the circadian rhythm, if there are weight issues, and as long as they are under 65 years old, do not do this in individuals over 65 years old, because it has been observed that in those over 65, there is an increase in the catabolism of muscle proteins. Therefore, caution should be exercised in older patients. One should implement a time restriction on meals, eating within a window of 8 to 12 hours. For healthy individuals who want to have protection against diseases associated with aging, a periodic fasting mimicking diet can be done. But always, I repeat, under the guidance of a professional trained in this type of therapy and fasting. I hope you understood it well, that you have assimilated it, and that I haven't gone too fast. Thank you very much for your attention, and for anything else, here is my email and my Instagram address. Thank you so much, really.